When you're pushed, but you have no option to take a step back, you do a weird thing with your arms, like this. But why is that? Well, I thought the answer was simple, conservation of angular momentum. But if you do a simple analysis of angular momentum, you reach the bizarre conclusion that you have to spin your arms forever, otherwise you'd fall over again. Basically, it's not as simple as it first appears. But we're going to get to the bottom of it with the help of this robot built for me by Gareth Barnaby. So let's just start at the start, because if you look at the slow-mo footage, the first thing I do is actually quite counterintuitive. I throw my arms forwards, but if my body is pushing my arms forwards, then my arms must be pushing my body backwards, which would make the problem worse. I was confused about that for about 5 minutes before I realized, well, I'm not a rocket. Like if I was literally throwing my arms away, it would be a problem. But because they remain part of my body, then it doesn't actually change my center of mass. So it's not really about the arms moving in any particular direction. It's about the fact that they're rotating. And this is the angular momentum explanation for why you flail your arms. Angular momentum is just a measure of how fast something is spinning and how massive it is. So this has a lot of angular momentum because it's spinning fast, and this has a lot of angular momentum because, well, it's a heavy thing spinning. And this has even more angular momentum than either of those because it's heavy and spinning fast. Now, angular momentum is a conserved quantity, which just means that the total angular momentum in a closed system can never change. Like you can change the angular momentum of an object, but not without changing the angular momentum of some other object in the opposite way so that it cancels out and the total angular momentum hasn't changed. Here's another example. I've got a motor that I can use to spin a disc. So the angular momentum of the disc is increasing. But if the motor is free to spin as well, watch what happens. It spins in the opposite direction, which you can think of as negative angular momentum. And so it cancels out the angular momentum of the disc, meaning that the total is 0. And it was 0 at the beginning, so angular momentum was conserved. You might have experienced this effect yourself if you've used a power drill. When you first turn it on, you feel a kick in the opposite direction to the direction that the drill bit is spinning. And it looks as though your body intuitively uses the conservation of angular momentum to stop falling over. So look, when your body is tilted backwards, gravity is pulling you down, but your contact point with the ground is here. So the force of gravity actually causes you to rotate around the pivot point. You might call your pivot point feet. But anyway, gravity causes your angular momentum to increase. In this case, anti-clockwise. Now you might think you'd need to spin your arms in the opposite direction to counteract the angular momentum of your body, but you actually need to spin your arms in the same direction that your body is falling. I think I can explain why, but just to be clear, whenever I say body, I mean your body minus your arms. So to restore balance, I need my body to start turning clockwise. But how can that happen if the total angular momentum of the system needs to be conserved? Well, you do it by rotating your arms in the opposite direction to the direction that you want your body to rotate. In other words, the same direction that your body is falling in. There's actually an easier way to think about it than conservation of angular momentum, which is to think about twisting forces or torque. In the same way that the accelerating drill bit leads to a twisting force on your hand, your accelerating arms lead to a twisting force on your body. In other words, it's angular acceleration that leads to the force. It's just like Newton said, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, except in the realm of spinning things. So by spinning your arms into the fall, you're twisting your body out of the fall. But here's the thing, you'll know from using a power drill that you only get that kick at the very beginning during spin up. Once the drill bit is spinning at a constant rate, you don't feel that twisting force anymore. In other words, it's angular acceleration that leads to a force. So if you were leaning back and spinning your arms at a constant rate, well, gravity would still be able to pull you over. So to recover from a fall, your arms have to be spinning faster and faster the whole time. See, in this model, when I shove this stick figure, it spins its arms faster and faster until it's upright again. But now it's just standing there with its arms spinning like crazy. And it can't stop spinning its arms because of the conservation of angular momentum. In other words, if the body applied a twisting force to the arms to slow them down, well, the arms would apply an equal and opposite twisting force on the body, making it fall over. But clearly humans don't have that problem. So what is it that we're doing? Well, it's hard to look at the code that's running in our brains, but we can look at the code that runs inside a balancing robot, like this Messenger 300 bot. And when you look at the code, you find actually quite a simple equation. The amount of torque that should be applied to the arms of the robot depends on just three things: how tilted back the robot is, how fast it's tilting back, and how fast the arms are already spinning. So this is the equation. The torque that should be applied to the arms is some number multiplied by the tilt, plus some other number multiplied by how fast the robot is tilting over, and some third number multiplied by how fast the arms are spinning already. But let's forget about that last term for a second and imagine that the robot only cares about the first two things. So we just need to find the optimum values for A and B that minimize how much the robot is tilted over and how fast it's tilting in the wrong direction, and that will bring the robot back to upright. And you do have to minimize both. Like, you can minimize tilt very quickly like this, but then you overshoot because you haven't minimized tilt speed. So this is what it looks like when you try to minimize both. And so look, you can see the problem. The robot is upright, but its arms are still spinning. And it can't just stop them spinning or it'll fall over again. That's why we need the third term in this equation. We also want to minimize how fast the arms are spinning. We want to minimize those three things at the same time. And when you actually run it, it becomes clear how is the robot able to slow its arms down without falling over. When the robot recovers to vertical, it actually keeps going a little bit, which means that the arms need to receive a twisting force in the opposite direction, which slows them down. In other words, you overshoot a little bit, and you can use that to bring your arms to a stop. We've chosen optimum values of A, B, and C here, but in general, you can vary them and get different behaviors. So maybe the robot ends up oscillating back and forth a little bit. But in general, you can decide what your priorities are in terms of damping and oscillation and things like that, just by varying these three values. That's not the whole story, of course, because if I push this robot a little bit too hard, then it falls over. This is Sparta. That's because this simple equation only works for small deviations. Robots that can recover from more extreme imbalances don't use that equation. Instead, they run lots of simulations a little way into the future and choose the one that works best. I'm massively oversimplifying there, but the point is, it's way more computationally demanding than what little Messenger 300 here is doing. But that's robots. What about humans? Do humans make similar calculations? Well, actually, it looks like they do, which I was really surprised about. What robots do doesn't map exactly to what humans do, but for example, when we're just balancing on our feet, standing, no one's pushing us around, the way our brains control our ankles is spookily similar to this equation. So we've got sensory neurons for things like tilt and acceleration and the way our limbs are moving. When they fire, these sensory neurons release neurotransmitters that are picked up by motor neurons that control our ankle muscles. And when I say motor neurons pick up the neurotransmitters, I mean they have receptors on their surface for those neurotransmitters. But the number of receptors they have is variable. The more receptors there are, the stronger the response is to those sensory inputs. In other words, these numbers from this equation are like the number of receptors that the motor neuron has that acts like a kind of multiplier for the input signal from the sensors. But actually, when you're pushed over and you start swinging your arms around and moving your hips, Your brain is doing something more like what this robot does, running simulations into the future. And actually the way it works is incredibly cool. The fast-acting part of your brain, the motor cortex, sends out a signal really quickly to get your body doing something that's probably helpful. But it also sends out an exact copy of that signal to the slow, thinky part of your brain called the cerebellum. And in there is something like your brain's physics engine. It takes a copy of that signal that went to your muscles and runs a simulation into the future to see if it was a good idea or not. And if corrections need to be made, then it sends out a follow-up signal to your muscles. The physics model in your brain works a bit differently to the one inside a robot. Like, it's not solving a whole load of equations. Instead, it's a literal neural network, a neural network that has been trained on all the times you've ever fallen over or nearly fallen over. You know, the natural world is full of examples of complex looking behavior that is actually governed by very simple rules, like the murmuration of starlings or the building of a spider web. And it looks as though our ability to stand upright is another example of that. But our ability to recover from a shove is actually genuinely computationally incredible. This robot doesn't have any security features because, I mean, why would it? But it means that I could install malicious code without really trying. What? Nothing? Do you know what? It reminds me of the early days of the internet. There was no encryption, people were using default passwords. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. But slowly people realized the problem and started fixing vulnerabilities. So now it's not so easy. But maybe it's going to start being easy again with the advent of AI models that have been trained to find vulnerabilities, like website SQL injection. So maybe we're going to see a lot more data breaches in the future, which is why it's more important than ever to get your personal data off as many databases as possible. In practice, that means targeting the companies that are spreading your data around. They're called data brokers. And if you ask them to remove your data, legally, they have to. The problem is there's hundreds of them and they all like to be asked in special different ways. And for me, at least, that meant that I was never going to do it. If that sounds like you, can I recommend the sponsor of this video, Incogni? Incogni has figured out how all the different data brokers work, and they just remove your data from all the data broker websites. And then they send new requests whenever your data pops up again. They do people search sites as well now, which is great. And on the unlimited plan, they also have a custom removal feature in case you ever find your data out there in the wild. If you're interested, the offer on this one is really good. If you go to incogni.com/science and use code SCIENCE at checkout, you'll get 60% off an annual plan. The link is also in the description, so check out Incogni today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to hit subscribe. And the algorithm thinks you'll enjoy this video next.